the big question that we're asking now is how to measure the moral value of an act. We already know about this in general. So someone give us an answer to this question. In general, for Bentham, how do I decide if an act is moral, if it's the act that I ought to take or not?
If it increases pleasure,
Good,
happiness, that's
good.
yeah.
But Nico's answer is 80% there. What would you add to it? Nico says, if it increases pleasure, then it's a good act or the right act to take. How do I know which act I should take, though, between, like, I don't know, giving a kid a lollipop and giving a homeless person a hot meal? Because both of those seem to increase pleasure. Or are they both equally good?
The one that increases more pleasure, and not just for yourself, for other people.
Good. So the one that creates the most pleasure and the least pain in the world as a whole, myself being included in that, and not just myself and not just others, but in the world. Was there another thought out there? So I still need to figure out between this question of like giving a kid a lollipop and a homeless person a meal, how do I figure out which one of these is going to increase pleasure and minimize pain the most? And that's what we'll talk about. And this is what Bentham talks about in the sections that I've posted, as well as Driver and the Singer reading. There are 7 dimensions. It's these categories through which we can measure the amount of pain or pleasure that is created by an action and judge the moral worth of that action by using these categories. That's very abstract, but as soon as we mention what they are, it will start to make sense. So what are these categories? The first that Bentham talks about is intensity. So pleasures can vary in their intensity. Some pleasures are very intense, and some are not very intense. Some pains are very intense, and some are not very intense. You might think, well, how can we measure them on a scale? But actually, this is something we're asked to do all the time, right? If you go to the doctor, she might say, well, the pain in your leg on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like extreme pain and 1 being none at all, where would you place it? It's not exact, but we can at least compare relative pains. So when we think about the intensity of a pain or a pleasure, it's kind of a questionable example, but it always makes me think of, maybe because I grew up in the 80s, something like the drugs that were around at the time. So if you remember, or not remember, cocaine, this is our pleasure scale here. And this is time scale on the Y here. So let's just see T1, T2, T3. Really, we could measure this in about hours. And then if we're looking at cocaine, cocaine was a drug that people took, I think at least, largely for the pleasure. And you can measure the intensity of that pleasure over time. After taking it, there's a certain latency, then it engages and increases for a while and then goes down. And cocaine was a relatively addictive drug, and it did cause its share of problems. What happened after the advent of cocaine that increased the problems?
Is it crack cocaine?
Yeah. So drug manufacturers and sellers figured out a way to take cocaine, mix it with a few other substances, dry it out, and create it in rock form. And then you had crack cocaine. Now, crack cocaine had a much higher, this is the intensity of the pleasure, it had a much higher peak intensity, but it lasted for a shorter time compared to regular cocaine. Also had a much higher crash relative to cocaine. And so you can imagine measuring either of these for the intensity of the pain created or the intensity of the pleasure. Now, another dimension that Bentham brings in is duration. And this is a matter of how long the pain or the pleasure lasts. Duration, it just means the time period. Right? So if we're looking back at the effects of the two drugs that we just looked at, you'll see that a drug user is going to be taking these things into effect, and it's going to affect the popularity of the drug as well. So when it comes to duration, which of these has a longer duration? Crack or traditional cocaine?
Cocaine.
Yeah, cocaine lasts longer, but with a lower peak pleasure at the specific time of the apex of the curve. And so there's this interplay between how long it lasts and the peak pleasure. So Bentham's going to say, if you're trying to figure out which act is the best, you're going to want to take the one that sort of balances these two, or really multiplies them times each other to get the maximum effect. So let's assume that cocaine had no negative effects at all, and we were just going to measure it out. And let's say this was a 3 on intensity, and this was a 1, and that these were otherwise entirely symmetrical curves. And so you measure 3 times 1 to get the effect of crack, and 3 for the duration times 1 for cocaine. And you might say, okay, the net pleasure is about the same. Of course, if I factor in the fact that after the pleasure occurs, there's these negative things, chances are that's going to get crossed out, right? Because let's say it has a 3 of pleasure, and then the pain lasts. For now, let's just say the pain's equal. Maybe it's not the best act in the long run, and we'll see more reason why it might not be the best than just that as well. So another question Bentham wants me to ask, if I'm trying to decide, and we talked a little bit about this last time, if an act is the right act to take, is about the probability that the pain or the pleasure will occur if I take this specific act. If we were just looking at like maximum benefit and cost, we might say something like, well, the right thing to do with your dollar is to buy a lotto ticket, because if you win the lottery, that's like $10 million, and you could feed like, I don't know, but 100,000 people who were hungry, and that's a lot to do with $1. Why is it that for the most part, buying a lotto ticket is not what a utilitarian is going to do? Why not use your $1 to buy a lotto ticket when if you win, you could achieve so much?
The probability is really low.
Yeah, the probability that I'm going to win is incredibly low. So if you think about it, let's assume, and these again are just random numbers, let's assume that the probability of winning the lotto, at one point I looked this up, but it's so incredibly small. Let's just say your probability is something like this of winning the lotto. But the amount of good you could do with it is, let's say, it's incredibly high. Still, when you multiply those by each other, the resulting number that you get is going to be relatively low. And so it's not going to be an act that I'm likely to take. Let's think back about our example here. In the case of taking the drug, what is the probability that if I take the drug, I will have I'll experience some pleasure? Is the probability high or low? Is it relatively high probability or low probability that I'll experience the pleasure?
Pretty high.
Yeah, probably pretty high, right? It's a direct physiological reaction. Eventually, I'm going to start being immune to certain doses and things like that, but probably it's pretty high. What about the probability of the pain? Is the pain that I'm going to get from it once the high wears off, is that high or low probability?
Also high.
Yeah, probably also high. Again, it's a direct physiological reaction. So in this case, if I was to multiply these by the pain and pleasure, it's probably going to be something like pretty close to a 1, because I know both those pains and pleasures will occur, as opposed to with the lotto. Or let's think more about the lotto. With the lotto, we already said that pleasure is very improbable, assuming we're just thinking about winning the money. What's the probability of the pain? And the pain's relatively low. I'm like, dang, I lost $1. But what's the probability that I'll experience that pain?
High. You will
Yeah.
lose.
Yeah, I'm going to lose almost certainly. And even if I win, eventually that win is going to come later. So I'm probably going to feel a little bit guilty about spending the dollar as soon as I spend it, even though the intensity of that suffering, giving up my dollar, is relatively low. All right. Bentham thinks we should also think about propinquity. This is an interesting one. Propinquity, by which Bentham just means how soon is it till the pain or the pleasure occurs. He thinks that if there's a pain you can put off, that pain is actually has less negative value than a pain you have to have right now. He also thinks that a pleasure that you get right now has more value than a pleasure that you have to wait for, which is interesting, right? Because one thing we're oftentimes told, especially when we're kids, is to like, well, you could get a 2 pleasure if you go out inside and play right now, but if you wait until later and you do what you care about right now, or you do what you have to do right now, later you'll get a 4 pleasure, a higher pleasure. But Bentham actually thinks that assuming that that's true, the pleasure that you get sooner is going to have a multiplicatory factor that's actually higher, let's just say it's 1.3 or something, than the one that you have to wait for, because it comes sooner. So he actually thinks that it is more valuable to get something that the payoff comes now rather than having to wait. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's one thing that gets factored in to the calculus that he's trying to introduce. You might think about something like your schoolwork relative to this, right? Well, you have to do your schoolwork, you take the pain now, but the pleasure comes later. Bentham thinks that having to wait actually does, in this case, matter. Again, it's not the only thing. It just needs to be factored in when making a utilitarian choice. Any questions so far?
So he thinks that pleasure, like immediate pleasure, is better than long term or like pleasure in the future.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not that it's always better, right? I would always take a very low quality or low intensity pleasure because it comes now, but he thinks that it does matter. So in a case where 2 were exactly equal, like I give you something that has a payoff now or the exact same payoff next week, the one that's sooner is going to win out. Assuming that you're getting a very low intensity pleasure now, it's probably not going to be enough to swing it, but he thinks it at least matters in the calculation. The next dimension that Bentham talks about is fecundity. What does it mean to be fecund in general? It's one of those SAT words we have to memorize.
Fertile?
What's that?
Fertile?
Yeah, fertile, exactly. So another question Bentham is concerned about here is how fertile is this act in producing pleasures, not just now, but future pleasures as well? Or if it causes pain now, is it going to cause more pains later? Can you think of any examples of this? What's a case of let's go with pleasure first, a pleasure that produces more pleasures later?
Making a lot of money.
Making a lot of money might be a good example, right? Because you make the money, it's exciting that you're making the money. And then why would you say it's also fecund? Terry, give us an example of how the fecundity comes out of it.
You have a lot more opportunities to do more things.
Exactly. So you enjoy earning the money, and then that money creates these further opportunities, like that trip to Fiji, that private resort where you have a glass bottom,
I need a vacation.
hut, which I've never experienced, but it looks like it's fun. So what about something like if we were to use these dimensions of fecundity back on this example? How do you think fecundity would affect something like my decision to use or to not use cocaine of any stripe?
The pleasure diminishes every time you do it.
Yeah, exactly. For very good physiological reasons, the pleasure that I get out of it is actually going to diminish. So taking it now actually decreases my ability to get pleasure out of it later. The pain, on the other hand, is likely to increase. Think about the pain of my crash, but also the pain about the effect that it has on my ability to achieve other things and my family and so on. So even if it seems like we're measuring just this pleasure, once we take into account something like the fecundity, what are the other things that occur that are pleasures or pains? Pain is probably going to be a good deal higher if I let myself get to the point where I'm addicted, habituated, and other problems can occur, right? Okay. Any questions about fecundity? All right. You can think of something simple too, like just a friendship, right? Let's say you take the time to say, to be nice to somebody in Starbucks. There's actually some classic examples of this in popular media now, where people at Starbucks are creating fecundity. Has anyone been sort of like seeing these in the news? Very fecund, kind acts at Starbucks?
Yes, and there's another way people pay each other's bridge tolls for the guy behind.
Exactly. So this is one of those examples of fecundity. People paying bridge tolls for the person behind them or paying for the next person's latte, right? Someone pays for you and you feel good about it, and you do it for the next person and they feel good. The person who initiated this chain just did a simple act, and that act ended when the person behind them felt good, but it created a chain of responses that meant that a bunch of people felt good about the fact that someone was thinking about them at Starbucks. Okay, now I want to acknowledge a kind of tricky issue here. Can you see how duration and fecundity might be a little bit difficult to tell the difference between? Why is there some ambiguity here between what counts as duration versus fecundity?
I guess there's overlap between what's going to be good and what's going to be bad, because over time, things might turn more painful. Like if you pay for everybody's coffee, then you don't have any more money for your bills at the end of the month or something.
Okay, that's true. So for every act that I take, there's always going to be a risk that that same act causes a pain. And Bentham always wants me to include that, although that could be for either duration or for fecundity.
Isn't it that duration is in like a single instance of how long, the pleasure is, and then fecundity is like the overtime, like, the longevity of, the chain events in the future that the pleasure causes.
Good, yeah. And it's even hard to sort of like, yeah, describe it, but I think you did a great job. So let's say with something like the Starbucks thing, if I said I bought someone else coffee at Starbucks, that's something that has a duration that's relatively short, right? It went to the next person and stopped. If on the other hand, I describe my behavior as saying, I started a chain of generosity, and the chain is what I created, I could describe the event in one of two ways. So I could say, if I describe it as a chain, I would say it had a huge duration. And if I described it as just a single event, like I bought someone coffee, then the duration is short. On the other hand, if the duration is short, then the fecundity is going to be large, right? So if I say, all I did was buy someone Starbucks, but a bunch of other things happened, all these other events of people buying other people's Starbucks, then it's fecund, right? On the other hand, if I just say, I did one thing, which was start a chain, and let's say it had some fecundity because when someone went to their job or whatever, they were kind. So the fecundity is minimal relative to the duration. So this is not to say, I mean, I do have questions that's going to, on the quiz, that are going to ask you to say, is this an example of duration or fecundity? The reason I think I can still ask this question is because what I'm asking you to do is, given the description that I'm offering, which one does it fit within? So make sure you pay attention to the description itself. If it's being described as a series of different events that come from a single initial event, then the issue is one of fecundity, right? If I'm describing one single, I mean, something that could be broken into several events as just like one thing, then the issue is one of duration. So this ultimate like philosophical question of what separates events from events or objects from objects, the study is called mereology, one of those like distant disciplines within philosophy, but you might want to study it at some point. Doesn't matter to us that much. As long as you have in mind what duration and fecundity are, you can use them, and if you put one in for the other in your own analysis, it's totally fine. Either one could be appropriate. Any questions about that? Okay. So the next dimension that Bentham talks about here is purity. And actually, this is, I think, the issue that Sharon was just bringing up, that we have to compare the pains and the pleasures at the same time to get a good measure of the actual pleasure. We can't talk about just one or the other. So an act is, or an event has pure pleasure, just in case the pleasure isn't coming with a bunch of pain. And the act has pure pain, just in case there's a bunch of pain, or the pain that exists at least, doesn't have with it a correspondingly similar amount of pleasure. So in this case, obviously, in the case of pleasures, pleasures are good and better to the extent that they are pure, whereas pains are worse to the extent that they are pure. We're looking for a higher purity in our pleasures. What's an example? Can anyone think of an example of a pleasure that isn't as pleasurable because it's mixed with a pain? I think it's coming immediately to mind for me.
Maybe like driving like fast on a freeway.
That's a nice example. At
Like-
least in my case, even at a specific time, like I'm feeling the pleasure of the exhilaration and the pain of like feeling guilty at the same time. Like maybe I'm gonna hurt somebody. Or maybe like saying something mean to a friend that you really wanted to get out has the same thing. You're like, I still wanted to say it. At the same time, I feel horrible that it's coming out of my mouth, and I know it was a bad choice. So yeah, that might be a good example. It's a pleasure, and the pleasure might even be intense, but if it's not pure pleasure, if it has the pain at the same time kind of canceling it out, then maybe it doesn't have as much value.
How about buying like super, like an example, like buying like super expensive like headphones or something?
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, I don't know how many of us have had to invest in some technology since COVID started. But every time something comes from Amazon, I'm like, yay! I'm happy that it came, and I'm also like, oh, pang of guilt that I bought another thing, even though I'm pretty sure it's going to be useful and I need it. Like this cool tablet that I'm using right now. Are you impressed with that? Pain and pleasure at the same time. All right. Now each one of these. Oh, sorry. Was there a thought?
Yeah, is pain, did you say pleasure is always better, a higher ratio than pain on the calculus?
So ultimately what we're looking for, if we were to use these kind of numbers, let's assume that we had pleasure and pain. And the math isn't that important. It's just like for illustration. But let's assume something was very pleasurable and minimally painful. And this came out to like a 5, right? And let's assume that something with the same scale here was not that pleasurable, but also rather painful. And this comes out to a 1. Now, Bentham doesn't explicitly give us the math for it, but the idea is just that sometimes I'll say pleasure over pain, because that's the easiest way to reflect the fact that the pain is taking away from the pleasure because it exists. I mean, for all Bentham says, this could also be like a factor of subtraction, right? The key idea, because he's not that clear about the math, is just to think about the fact that whenever there's pain, it takes away from the value of the action and its ultimate measurement. And whenever there's pleasure, it adds to it. What Bentham is going to want me to do is think about which act is going to maximize this number. And that's the act that I should take. So the one that I should take is always the one with the best ratio of pleasure to pain. Usually a ratio is considered a fraction, and so this would be the more like natural way to represent it, but that's for an advanced graduate class in economics and civil engineering to think about how the specifics of the math would work. As long as we know we're always trying to maximize the ratio of pleasure to pain, that's the most we can really think about, I think, in this context. So remember that so far I've been talking about pleasures and pains largely just in terms of how much it affects the person who does it. But remember that each person counts equally when it comes to pleasure and pain and my actions for Bentham, which means that this one is quite clearly a factor of multiplication, like a factor in the truest sense, right? So if I can cause, let's say, 4 units of happiness, and I can do it for 4 people, it's quite clear that that just would be a multiplicatory factor. And the answer would be like, doing it for 4 people is 4 times as good as doing it for 1 person. Assuming that the amount of pleasure that's going to be created is the same. So if I could create 4 units of pleasure with the same duration and intensity, blah, 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 and I could do it for 4 people, it's going to be 4 times better than if there's 1 person and I just get a total of 4 out of it. The number of people matters. All right. Now, one objection to all of this that Bentham discusses, but it's important to see his response because it explains what Bentham even means in the first place, is you can imagine someone saying, you gotta be kidding me, Bentham. I'm going to do this kind of math for every action that I take. By the time I'm done calculating all of this, my life is gonna be over and I won't have done anything. Now, Bentham actually addresses this point quite explicitly. And he says, yeah, I know that you can't in every situation actually sit down and calculate this, but you should have these ideas and these relationships in your head. And the amount that you should calculate is just however much is useful and beneficial in this situation. can you see how this is the only thing Bentham really can say, right? Let me put it another way in the reverse and see if someone can answer it. If I'm Bentham and I believe in the principle of utility, which says always do the act which maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain, when should I not spend much time at all calculating the pleasure and pain? I said that in a horrible way. If anyone can answer it, go for it. Otherwise, I'll try to rephrase it. Let me put it this way. If I'm Bentham, what could be my justification for not taking the time to calculate? Like a
Because
sincere, legitimate justification that's justified by his theory.
because if the calculation causes more pain, then it kind of contradicts.
Exactly, said perfectly. So Bentham's going to say, when should you calculate? The same time you should do anything, which is when it's likely to produce more pleasure over pain to do the calculation than not to. So I think this is actually, in its simplest form, it's actually not a good complaint about Bentham. There's ways to beef it up to make it meaningful, but if your only complaint is, this would take too long to do, the complaint doesn't really work, because Bentham says, yes, I agree. You're not supposed to be actually calculating, like, should I take a breath right now? Or something like that. Obviously, if you hold your breath, you can do an estimation without taking any time at all to realize that's a bad idea if it goes longer than about 20 seconds. And I don't need to do any calculation. A couple examples that I give in the lecture were something like, imagine that a lion has broken free from the zoo while you're having a picnic with your family. How much time would a utilitarian tell me to spend deciding whether or not we should end our picnic?
Probably like little or no time.
Yes, probably little or no time, because I can see right away that the benefits of the picnic are clearly outweighed by the benefits of avoiding a hungry tiger on the loose. But imagine that the scenario went with something like, now imagine yourself as president of the United States, and you see something like an injustice around the world or a threat to the United States, and you have to decide, should we send our troops into a war? Well, in a situation like this, I think most of us would actually be a little bit upset if the president didn't call in his commanders and say, what's the likely cost of this? And how many people are we likely to lose? And how long will it take to win the war? And what will be the effects on the global stage? And who will suffer? And what will be the outcome? So yes, clearly in some cases, we're going to want to calculate quickly. But in some cases, for example, if a president isn't thinking about what's the likely duration of this war, that's a bad thing. If a president isn't thinking about what's the possible fecundity here, it causes some pain now, but will it cause future pains later? The president has to take those things into account. The president isn't thinking about how intense will the pain be? How many people will it affect? So Bentham's idea isn't that you should spend your life doing math. It's that when things really matter and you have the time to do it, you should think things out carefully with these dimensions in mind. And when you know you have to make a decision quickly, use them for as much time as you have. And if that means basically no time, then that's the choice you would make too, as a utilitarian.
Question.
Yeah, go for it.
So say it's like a big decision, like the, sending in troops, but you have very little time to do it. Would Bentham be on the side of the default should be not to act, or the default should be to act with the information you have and making a snap judgment?
So I think this is a great question. So someone else answer it. Let's assume Bentham is consistent. What would Bentham say for a case like this? If I don't have very much time at all, but we know it's a huge and complicated question with a lot of repercussions, what would Bentham say that's consistent with his theory? Would he say, okay, then don't act at all because you don't have enough information? What could he say? Because this really happens to us in bigger and smaller ways in real life. What would a utilitarian do?
Do quick math.
Yeah, I mean, presumably it's something like that, right? Because Bentham's going to answer even your question with the same answer, which is, I still think, I'm speaking for Bentham here, he's going to, I still think that you have to do the best you can to estimate it in the long run. And if you said something like, well, in the past, I've made decisions quickly in big scenarios, and I've been unhappy with the results. They've caused more suffering than good, so I won't do it. That would be utilitarian justification. If you said, this matters so much that I have to make a choice because the possible pain is too high if I don't interfere, let's say, with this war, that would be a justification as well. And so you just have to do the best you can to use the principles. And the principle itself is the only principle. There's no like secondary principle for utilitarian, which sometimes is a problem for them. It's just try to use the principle as consistently as you can. And it could turn out that you made the wrong choice, right? I mean, that's the thing about the utilitarian calculus, is that you can make the best choice that you can make what you thought was the best choice in the situation. If it creates catastrophe, it's the ultimate outcome that matters. And so it's still a bad act, which is something that can be hard to sort of keep your mind around, because what decisions always happen ahead of the fact, right? We never make a decision about something that already happened, so we never know the results. So what we're thinking about now is, here's the best way to calculate things, but ultimately Bentham's going to judge me on the actual results that occur, except in the case of probability. So we can see that Bentham himself isn't entirely consistent with this, because probability is not actually an event, right? After things occur, they have a probability of 1 for it happened and 0 for it didn't happen. So interestingly, Bentham kind of gets himself in a bit of a pickle here, because the probability of something, things only are given probabilities, and this gets into some probability theory that's not worth getting into, but things only meaningfully have probabilities before they occur. Now, if you want to look up theories about Bayes and the frequentists and get into a whole mess about that, it's a great thing to look up. But what this at least seems to imply is that, well, I don't know, that's a tough question actually, because some people will say that probabilities exist after the fact, so I'm just going to leave that in the past. Take philosophy of statistics after you transfer. Okay, well, this is pretty much it for what I wanted to show you. I'm trying to think if I want to take the time or not to go over another example. Maybe I will do so just kind of quickly, because this will help to cement the ideas in your mind as well. So here is an example. So let's assume that we were making an ordinary kind of choice here. You have two choices, and our class is 11. Most of us are probably up by that time, but let's assume that our class was a little earlier maybe. And let's assume we were just choosing between two choices, to go to class or to sleep in. Let's assume our class was at 8, or I don't know, some of us would probably like to sleep to 11 too. It wouldn't be the first time I ever did it. So here are the two things that I am choosing between. And then obviously most real world choices, I have more choices than just two. It's just a way to simplify a way of thinking about it though. So do I go to class or do I sleep in? Now let's think about the intensity of both the pleasure and the pain for both these choices. And I'll need your feedback for this. So if you just choose to go to class, you get up and you go to your Zoom meeting, how intense is any pain you might get from going to class?
Like a 1.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it, Terry. Terry says it's a 1, very low on the scale. Some of you might disagree. Well, how intense is the pleasure then of going to class?
You don't want to hear the answer to that one. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Don't say 10
Um,
because I won't believe you. Say something that makes me feel good about myself.
Yeah, I'll give you a solid 7.
I'd say
That's too
6.
high. It is kind. I'm gonna say it's a 4. Maybe you enjoyed yourself. Now, what about sleeping in? How much pain do you get when you turn over and you hit the snooze button?
Like a 3.
I really feel it.
So maybe at least a little bit. How much pleasure do you get from hitting the snooze?
I think it's a 10. But
Did I hear 10?
At least a 5.
To wake up? Are you serious?
No, it's the pleasure of hitting the snooze button and going back to sleep. You're like, oh yes.
Oh yeah, okay.
That,
That's
that can feel
solid.
pretty high. So I'm choosing to sleep in. I hit the snooze. So far it looks like there's minimal pain going to class, but a lot of pleasure at not going to class. Not because you didn't want to see us, but just because you got to sleep in. Now, what about duration? There's some pain going to class, and the scale of like 0 to infinity, how long does that pain last relatively?
Like 6
Probably just
minutes.
while you're here, right? I mean, let's give it a 2 because it's not like the pain of, I don't know, pulling a splinter out. It only lasts for a second, but it doesn't last all that long. How long does the pleasure last? Well, I'm sure it lasts for a lifetime. Your whole day is better, but I'll be less generous to myself and say the pleasure is while you're here. How long does the pain of sleeping in last? I don't know. What do you think? Do you still feel guilty after you wake up, or
Yeah.
just for a second? So let's say the pain
Or
lasts
4
If
hours.
you miss class, you might have more pain trying to catch up.
right, which might go into duration, or it might also go here into fecundity. And then how long does the pleasure last of sleeping in?
Couple
I'm gonna say
hours,
this one's low. Oh, go ahead, Sharon.
maybe like an hour or two until you get up and feel crummy for having a late day.
Fair enough. Yeah. And really, once you're asleep, it's sort of the avoidance of pain, but not really, you don't feel the pleasure. At least I don't in the same way. Okay, so what about if we thought about the probability? What's the probability of getting at least some pain if you go to class? Let's be honest. That little bit of pain, like, oh, it's kind of a pain to do it.
Let's go with 2, I guess.
Yeah, I would say 2.
Oh, okay, wow.
Like it's not a big deal. It's just
That's nice. But it's not if is it a big deal, because that's the intensity. It's like, how much do you know that little bit of pain is going to be there? And
I think
then
there's
for the
more
pleasure, what's the
pain.
probability you're going to have enjoy yourself?
pretty low.
Probability you enjoy yourself is relatively low too. All right, we'll put it low here. The probability of the pain or pleasure occurring if you sleep in, if it's there, it's probably basically certain, right? You're gonna feel good when you hit the snooze button. Propinquity or nearness in time. How soon does the pain come when you decide to log into class? If you feel it, you probably feel it soon, right? What about the pleasures you get from class? Do those like pay off now, or do you have to wait for like, oh, 30 years from now, I finally realized why Professor Bodner said that. My life is more meaningful.
I think it's pretty close. Sometimes class is fun.
Ah, thanks.
I think
I'll
it
give
feels
myself
good to get it done.
That's true. Even
Yeah.
just doing it feels good. So maybe it's relatively high. Definitely for nearness in time when it comes to these. I mean, you feel the pain as soon as you make the choice. Although some of it probably comes later. So maybe that would be a little bit lower. The pleasure is pretty much immediate, right? As soon as you're like, yes, I'm gonna hit the snooze button, your body thanks you. All right, fecundity. Someone kind of already brought this up a little bit here. Does the pleasure invite more pleasures? Does the pain you get in class produce other pains once you're out of class? Or is the pain just something that you have to sit through while you're in class? It's hard for me to think of, I mean, you have the pain while you're there. I don't think it's very fecund. Like there's a bunch of other pains that come from it. What about the pleasures of going to class? Does that create further pleasures later on?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe so, right? I mean, you had a chance to talk to a friend about it. You moved along your educational goals. So that is creating more pleasures compared to the pain, probably. Like someone already pointed out, if I sleep in, that has at least the probability or the possibility of creating a lot more pains later on when I'm like, okay, what did I miss? How do I make it up? Am I going to be ready? So it actually probably will generate more pain over time. When it comes to the pleasures of sleeping in, I don't know, what do you think about this? Does sleeping in produce more pleasures besides just the sleep in?
Yeah, because you're much more well rested for the rest of the day.
Yeah, you might say yes. It depends on the person. When I sleep in, I tend to be grumpy, but I think it's probably fair to say that, yeah, it produces more pains later on, but you also feel a little bit better. Okay, so in a way we have everything we need to think about purity. Is it mixed with the opposite? In the interest of time, I won't go too much into this, but you can already see that by looking at these, that we've said that in terms of purity, the pain is mixed with a lot of pleasure, which is a good thing in this case, as you've rated it so far. And the pleasure is mixed with not that much pain. So actually, sorry. So the pain is impure, which is a good thing because there's a lot of pleasure. And then the pleasure is relatively pure because there's little pain. So that's a good thing. When it comes to the pain of sleeping in, that has quite a bit of pleasure with it, so it's impure. The pleasure has quite a bit of pain actually with it as well, but maybe not as much, so that's relatively impure as well. Remember, it's pure if it kind of stands alone. Now, in this case especially, so far we've just been talking about me. Does extent play a role here? So let's assume I choose to go to class. And let's think about the pleasure first. Does the pleasure of my choice to go to class extend beyond me? And if so, how?
Well, we work in groups, so we would be missing a group member that might be important to us.
Absolutely. You'll be missing a group member who might be important to you. Your professor will be sad and think, what happened? Did I say the wrong thing to you? I hope you're okay. So it affects people beyond you. Maybe even beyond that, you became a doctor and you're trying to decide if you should harvest someone's organs. And you think, I remember from ethics class that I shouldn't do that. And a bigger difference is made. But probably, let's just give it a random number here. Extent is much higher. The pain probably isn't affecting that many more people because it's just something that you endure, but maybe it affects some. If you sleep in, does the pleasure of your sleeping in affect others? It depends. Alice actually kind of suggested that it did. Some of you seem to say it was mainly for me, but let's say it affects them a little bit. It's mainly a pleasure that you get. The pain could affect others depending on how well you manage with the fact that you've fallen behind a little bit. So let's give it a relatively low number here. Probably when it comes to affecting others, you have much more of a chance to affect others by going to school and learning those skills and moving along with your education than the number of people affected by your choice to sleep in. Definitely when it comes to fecundity, that will make a big difference. Okay, so we won't bother going through the complete calculus here. I kind of separate these out just to get you thinking about them so you can consider them independently. Now, we do have enough time for groups. And here's what I want to do. Let me stop sharing here with our group time.